Hello friend. I want to tell you about the Volkswagen Passat B5 car. The Volkswagen Passat B5 debuted in 1996 and was an absolutely groundbreaking car in its time. For the first time, a car appeared in the middle class that not only matched premium models in every respect, but also models of the upper class. Today we can laugh at this, but in fact in 1996 the Passat B5 was a technically more advanced car than the then Audi A6 C4. It was only a year later that Audi presented the A6 C5 model, which in comparison to the Passat was actually in the upper class. Generation. Facelift. What's with the naming? Let's start with the least important thing. Which generation is the Passat B5? It turns out that it is not the fifth, despite the name, but the fourth. The B4 generation is nothing more than a facelift of the B3, so the B4 is still the third generation of the model. It was similar with the Ford Mondeo, which received the MK2 designation after the facelift, but it is still the first generation. Except that both the Mondeo and the Passat were more than just a facelift. Rather, a thorough modification. And it was basically the same with the Passat in 2000, except that Volkswagen didn't change the number next to the name, but added GP, Gross Produktaufwertung, which means a thorough update. However, many sources separate the B5 and B5 Florida as different generations. The car is generally similar, almost identical in design, but when we look at the B5 and B5 FL, it seems that the differences are significant. The Florida looks much more modern and elegant. This is already important information. The mechanical parts are very similar or identical, but the bodywork is not. Smaller updates were carried out practically every year, but they mainly concerned engines. In 1997, the variant model, or station wagon, debuted. A major change of engines occurred during a major facelift. In 1999, the name of the four-wheel drive was also changed from Synchro to 4Motion, so if you buy a pre-facelift Passat with four-wheel drive, don't worry about the name, it's the same design. The car's reception was influenced by the new floor pan shared with the A4 model, with the engine placed longitudinally and the aluminum multi-link suspension at the front, tuned not only very comfortable, but also allowing for confident and stable driving at high speed. Although a classic torsion beam was used at the rear in the front-wheel drive versions. Only in the four-wheel drive versions was there independent suspension on the rear axle. In 2005, production of the Passat B5 was ended, replaced by an entirely new B6 model. Volkswagen Passat B5. What kind of car is it? The Volkswagen Passat B5, even from today's perspective, is a comfortable, safe and fairly modern car. Of course, it doesn't have as much electronics as the modern ones, and the only systems that assist driving are at most cruise control and parking sensors. Nevertheless, the well-preserved and fully functional Passat is still a delight to drive. In terms of space, it is not as spacious as, for example, the Ford Mondeo MK4 or Renault Laguna 2, but it cannot be said that it is cramped. Additionally, the excellent quality of the cabin and often rich equipment increase the utility value of the model. After the facelift, the fit was improved, which was already delightfully good before the facelift. Rich configurations with light leather gave the impression of a premium car. Today, not so, but the Passat still looks much better against the background of many newer, later presented models of the competition. The spaciousness of the Passat is legendary, but it's mainly about the boot of the variant version. It has a capacity of 495 L and is extremely flexible. The second thing is what happened to the Passat in the following years. Over time, it became a workhorse for construction when the pre-facelift models lost their value and the B4 model was increasingly difficult to buy. So nobody bothered with the upholstery and packed as much as they could into it. Today, it is a car primarily for people who want to spend little on a large, comfortable and, above all, cheap to maintain middle-class car. It has already lost its former prestige, although the most beautiful examples or the better versions are still not only pleasing to the eye, but also fun to drive. What engines were installed? There were so many engines throughout the production period of the Passat B5 that a separate article could be written about them. What is even more important? The range of units, the choice of power and types of power supply and configurations is so large that in the case of this car, the slogan, "Everyone will find something for themselves," is no longer an empty phrase. The weakest petrol engine has a capacity of 1.6 liters and gives the driver 100 horsepower, and the most powerful has a capacity of 4 liters and offers 275 horsepower. Interesting fact: the Passat B5 4.0 was more powerful than any petrol Audi A4 in history. Only the diesel in the B9 was more powerful, although it was not the most powerful Passat in history. Engines were constantly changing, and the most changes occurred after the facelift. At that time, the 1.6 and 2.3 petrol units were strengthened, but the 8-valve 2.0 engine lost 5 HP. From 2001, the range was complemented by a more technically advanced 20-valve equivalent with 130 HP. After the facelift, the 1.8 petrol engine without supercharging was withdrawn. All petrol units from the 2000 model year after the facelift met the Euro 4 standard. This will soon become important in the context of clean transport zones. The 2.3 engine was withdrawn quite early, in 2002, but it also met this standard after the facelift. Just before the end of production, the 4.0 variant was also withdrawn. The rest survived until the end of production. Diesel engines also underwent fundamental changes, especially the very popular 1.9 TDI, in which a power supply system based on unit injectors appeared from 1999. Initially, the 90 and 110 HP variants had a classic injection pump. A little earlier, in 1998, the 2.5 TDI V6 engine debuted, which spread its wings only after the facelift. It was offered at that time in 3 power versions, but in a total of 4 variants. In 2003, a 2.0 TDI diesel engine was introduced to the offer, which, in defiance of the Eurocrats, together with 2 2.5 TDI units met the Euro 4 standard, although no Passat B5 ever had to meet it. Manual and automatic gearboxes were offered for the above-mentioned engines. In almost all petrol versions, manual gearboxes had 5 gears. Only the 4.0 variant received a 6-speed gearbox. In diesels before the facelift, it was similar. Only one variant had a 6-speed gearbox, the 1.9 TDI, 115 HP, year 2000, and the 2.5 TDI. After the facelift, only the 1.9 TDI had a 5-speed gearbox, although one 130 HP variant had a 6-speed gearbox. Automatic gearboxes have a classic design with a converter, but there were 2 variants, 4-speed and 5-speed Tiptronic. The 4-speed gearbox was used more before the facelift in the petrol variants 1.6, 1.8 and 2.0. After the facelift only in the 2.0. However, in a pair with diesels it appeared before the facelift with the 1.9 TDI units with an injection pump, 90 and 110 HP, and after the facelift only in the 1.9 TDI with 100 HP. The 5-speed Tiptronic was combined before the facelift with the 1.8 turbo, 2.3, 2.8 petrol engines and with the 1.9 TDI, 115 HP, and 2.5 TDI diesels. After the facelift with the 1.8 turbo, 2.8 and 4.0 petrol engines, as well as with the 1.9 TDI, 130 HP, and 2.5 TDI diesels. The 1.9 TDI, 101 HP engine did not get any automatic gearbox before the facelift, and after the facelift the 2.0 TDI and the 1.6, 2.0 20 volts and 2.3 petrols. The Passat also had 4-wheel drive. Initially, the trade name was Synchro, then 4Motion, but the design was the same, a Torsen central differential, similar to the one in the Audi A4. The multitude of versions with such a drive does not mean that we will easily buy such a car. Which engine to choose? Choosing an engine would be easy enough if all the variants were popular. Currently, you have to reckon with the fact that when buying a Passat B5, it's best to buy what's in good condition. Let's go through all the engine versions, regardless of their availability. The basic petrol version 1.6, approximately 10% of offers, has insufficient power for this model and a rather short gearbox, so it is not very suitable for routes, although of course it is not that it is impossible to drive at all. Performance is poor, and fuel consumption is relatively high, approximately 9 L/100 kilometers, which encourages the installation of LPG. A car with this unit is even slower in combination with a 4-speed automatic. However, it is an almost completely failure-free unit and the cheapest to service or repair. The 1.820 volts and 2.08 volts versions perform better in terms of dynamics, a total of about 13%. The power of both engines is similar, but their designs are very different. In terms of performance and fuel consumption, these are similar units, needing about 9 to 10 L/100 kilometers. The smaller engine has 2 camshafts and a completely different, slightly more delicate design. The larger one is very simple, almost indestructible. It is often converted to run on LPG. In practice, both variants can be treated as equal. Only the 1.8 was available only before the facelift and until the 1999 model year, while the 2.0 was available from the 2000 model year. Yet another engine is the naturally aspirated 2.020V, approximately 5% of offers, with a design similar to the 1.820 volts, but confused with the 2.08V. Noticeably more dynamic with the potential for lower fuel consumption, but with a huge problem of oil consumption and significantly more failure-prone. Ultimately, when choosing one of the basic Passat B5 variants, rather avoid the 2.020 volts, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend the 1.820 volts, but a very good choice would be the 2.08V. Ultimately, if you don't care about dynamics at all, the 1.6 is also a good choice. The middle ground, in terms of dynamics, is represented by 2 units of very different design but almost identical performance. The 1.8T variant is very highly valued, approximately 10% of offers. Power of 150 HP and acceleration to 100 km per hour in around 9 seconds mean that such a Passat no longer suffers from sluggishness. What's more, the considerable torque available already below 2000 revolutions per minute gives the feeling of using an even more powerful engine than in reality. The car is extremely pleasant to drive, and fuel consumption is good, on average about 10 L/100 kilometers. It is worth noting that the potential for lower fuel consumption is very large, but you have to skillfully use the characteristics of this unit. 1.8 turbo is in my opinion absolutely number one among all petrol engines. It is a perfect compromise between failure rate, service costs and performance. The engine does not break down too often and works well on LPG. The only thing missing from the ideal was 4-wheel drive. So if you want this solution, but also decent performance, the equivalent of the 1.8T is the 2.3 engine with a VR5 design, regularly combined with 4-wheel drive, although it was only an option. This is a unit of a rare design, but solid and one of the few with a chain timing drive. The 2.3 VR5 engine, less than 1% of offers, has one undeniable advantage and one disadvantage. It is worth buying such a Passat for the sound alone. The engine, revved to about 4,000 revolutions per minute, causes shivers. Many a sports car with 3 times more power sounds much worse. The performance of the 2.3 and 1.8T is very similar, even when we are talking about the facelifted versions, where the 2.3 developed 170 HP. The units have completely different characteristics, because the VR5 develops maximum torque at 3,200 revolutions per minute, which forces the driver to rev the engine higher. Subjectively, the 1.8 turbo will be a more dynamic engine. The unique sound of the VR5 makes drivers eagerly rev up, which ultimately results in fuel consumption of 11 to 12 L/100 kilometers. Of course, sensible driving will improve fuel consumption to 9 to 10 L/100 kilometers, but every Passat 2.3 user knows how hard it is to resist. The Passat B5 with this unit is simply a car for people who love motoring, not pragmatists. The top-of-the-range engines are the 2.8 V6 and 4.0 W8, totaling less than 5% of listings. Admittedly, they are extremely different, but both share common features, such as good dynamics, high fuel consumption and high repair costs. The very tight placement of them under the hood means that they must be removed for many service activities. The 2.8 V6 engine is famous for its great durability, but also many minor faults that do not affect mobility. Unfortunately, due to high repair costs, these engines can be extremely neglected. If we come across a well-maintained car, it will serve for a very long time. The dynamics are good, but only in the version with a manual gearbox. The automatic takes away the performance and lowers it to the level of 1.8 T. You have to reckon with fuel consumption at the level of 12 L, 100 kilometers, and with the automatic even a liter higher. The 4.0 W8 engine is a separate issue in the subject of service and repairs. We can assume that whatever we do with this unit, we go to a specialized workshop, because this unique design requires a lot of knowledge and experience. The engine itself is not defective or problematic. Fuel consumption is practically irrelevant here, and it is obvious that the W8 gives the best performance in the entire range. Of all the petrol engines, it is worth focusing on 2.08 volts, which is ideal for undemanding use on LPG, and 1.8 T, which is a great compromise between all the others. However, this does not mean that buying 1.6 or 1.8 does not make sense. I would avoid 2.0 volts, and for people who are not looking for emotions, I do not recommend versions 2.3 and 2.8. Among diesels, contrary to appearances, we also have a lot of variety. Initially, 1.9 TDI engines, over 50% of all offers, worked on a classic pump, and these were very successful designs. Today, these donkeys are usually worn out, which does not mean that they will not last long. Practically all 1.9 TDI variants should be treated the same in terms of failure rate or repair costs. Later versions of this unit already had unit injectors, which does not mean they are better or worse. They are more economical. They can burn an average of about 6 L, 100 kilometers. Only versions with automatic or four-wheel drive burn significantly more. The choice is more a question of the car's condition than of the specific version, although it is obvious that the 130 HP 1.9 TDI has the best performance, but it can also potentially be used more heavily. In pre-facelift cars, it is worth looking for versions with 90 and 110 HP on the pump. They are not very dynamic, but they still have better performance than the petrol 1.6. After the facelift, the recommended engine is the 130 HP variant, especially with the AVF code, which accelerates to 100 km per hour in about 10 seconds. Looking at the 2.5 TDI versions, about 2% of offers is more or less the same as buying a 4.0 W8. The only point in having a car with this diesel is performance. Average fuel consumption of 8 to 9 L, 100 km practically disqualifies this variant as economical. It is better to drive with the 2.8 V6 on LPG. On the other hand, the Passat was exceptionally nicely configured with these engines, often with four-wheel drive and automatic. You can read about the problems, good and bad versions, below. A rather rare variant is the Passat 2.0 TDI, less than 1% of offers, because this engine was installed towards the end of production, and it is not exactly the same engine that appeared in the Passat B6, but it was installed in the Superb. What is worth emphasizing is that it has a factory-fitted DPF filter and meets the Euro 4 standard. Despite its faulty design, if it has already done 200,000 kilometers, you can trust it, because it has most likely been fixed or you have come across a good copy. Currently, it is worth looking for the 2.0 TDI variant as a replacement for the 1.9 TDI, but it should be noted that this engine has bad reviews, so reselling the car will be more difficult. When buying a diesel, except for the 2.5 TDI, you should stick to the principle that the better the condition of the car and the younger the year, the potentially better the engine. To sum up the subject of engines in general, today, only non-supercharged petrol units will be a safe choice, preferably 8-valve 1.6 and 2.0. They give the greatest chance of long-term use. An alternative may be 1.8 turbo, provided that it is in good condition. It will drive for a long time and at the same time give the right performance. It is best to give up on diesels altogether, but if you absolutely want such an engine, then look only for a 4-cylinder in the best possible condition. Typical engine faults. Let's start with petrol engines. There's no point in writing much about the 1.68 volts and 2.08 volts units, because they are very simple and durable designs, practically reliable. They have some problems with the throttle or ignition system, but these are only due to massive neglect or improper repairs. It is worth focusing on the highly valued 1.8 turbo variant. The engine itself is mechanically durable, but the equipment sometimes causes problems. A drop in power or uneven operation are usually the result of worn ignition coils or leaks in the rubber lines. And there are plenty of places where they can appear. The naturally aspirated equivalent with 125 HP does not have such problems. Another cause may be a dirty throttle valve. Unlike, for example, the VW Golf IV, in the Passat, the probability of turbocharger wear in the 1.8T engine is greater due to the differently designed lubrication system. The pipe that supplies oil to the turbocharger gets clogged earlier, which is worth knowing and checking after purchase, or better yet replacing the pipe. It is also worth checking the condition of the oil strainer filter, which gets clogged in many engines. The cylinder head can be problematic, and specifically the hydraulic valve lifters, which make noise after a longer mileage. When you can hear them, it's worth replacing. When replacing the timing belt, a set costs about $125. You should also check the chain connecting the two shafts. Variable valve timing has already appeared in engines after the facelift. A dual-mass flywheel was not without, but it is relatively cheap, about $350. In the 2.0 engine with 130 HP, there is a common problem with oil consumption, weak rings, as well as uneven operation of the unit. It is worth noting that although the timing is belt-driven, the shafts are connected by a short chain, which tends to stretch after about 200,000 kilometers. Unfortunately, this is often the cause of engine problems that is ignored. The design of the engine block makes it practically impossible to repair it, although it is durable in itself, and valves in the head often break. The engine is also not very resistant to overheating, so it must be kept in very good condition to make a high mileage. Despite the very low popularity of the VR5 engine, it is worth mentioning its shortcomings because it is a unit for connoisseurs. Unusual, because in practice it is an inline engine, one head, but in theory it works a bit like a V despite its seemingly complicated design. The 2.3 engine before the facelift is a very primitive unit made of cast iron according to the old school, without any major fancies. Only after the facelift did 10 additional valves appear in the head. Fortunately, this did not affect durability or failure rate. Engines in good condition can easily withstand mileage of 300 to 400,000 kilometers. The maintenance costs of the 2.3 are increased by replacing the timing drive. Two chains stretch after about 200 to 250,000 kilometers, which in itself is expensive. Timing at the rear, engine or gearbox removal required. The parts themselves can be purchased for about $100 to $150. Additionally, it may be necessary to replace the dual-mass flywheel, about $500 per part. Sometimes there are problems with engine operation caused by left air from leaks, damaged ignition coil or incorrect operation of the throttle valve or variable length intake manifold system. High oil consumption is usually a problem with valve seals and happens quite rarely. When buying a Passat with a 2.3 VR5 engine, it is worth spending a little more on a well-maintained model because mechanics are reluctant to repair it. After warming up the unit, pay attention to the operation of the cooling pump, which, driven electrically, should still make noise for a few minutes after the unit is turned off. The cooling system is very important in this engine, so if the car has leaks or signs of head gasket damage, it is better to let it go. Fluid leaks or improper operation of the cooling system may also result from a trivial cause, such as a cracked thermostat housing. Unfortunately, the repair is expensive because access to it is very difficult. When deciding to buy a Passat 2.8 volt 6, you should expect high repair costs. One of the biggest problems is oil leaks, and eliminating them involves removing the unit. With the car priced at around $3,000 and repair costs around $750, few people want to do it, so the problem gets worse. Another fairly large expense is replacing the timing belt, parts alone about $150, which requires removing the entire front of the car, and therefore also depressurizing the air conditioning system. In the case of smaller units, this is not necessary. There is also a dual-mass flywheel, about $500, of course in the configuration with a manual transmission. If you want to buy a Passat W8, you should not be afraid of its failure rate. It is low, but of the failures themselves, they are expensive. In general, the engine is very well developed and practically does not break down. However, if something needs to be replaced, you should know that there are almost no substitutes. You have to buy the original part, sometimes even order it from an authorized service center and wait. What's more, you also have to find the right mechanic who will undertake the repair, which is not easy at all. So you simply have to reckon with the fact that each failure can cost 4 to 5 more than in the case of other petrol units. Buying a Passat W8 with engine failures is not an investment that will ever pay off, and certainly not an opportunity to drive a nice car. It's better to look for an Audi with a 4.2-liter V8. That's all about petrol engines. As for diesels, absolutely anything can happen with the 1.9 TDI. All the typical faults for diesels, injectors, turbo, intake system, EGR, flow meter, are present here, with the exception of problems with the DPF filter, which was not installed in the Passat B5. The unit is simple, but it is already quite prone to failures. Durability is another matter. This engine can be revived many times and at a relatively low cost. What is worse, it is already more profitable to repair it, even comprehensively, than to replace it with a used one, because in this respect the availability of good copies is getting weak. Due to their age, the engines can be extremely neglected, and what is more, repaired in a way that is not compatible with any technology. Therefore, it is worth looking for a copy imported from the West, and not necessarily from Germany. The failure rate of 2.5 TDI engines is terrible, and in fact, you shouldn't buy cars from the pre-facelift period. Those who have them, let them enjoy it. Let's leave them this pleasure. The same applies to cars after the facelift with 150 HP. Until 2003, problems with the injection and lubrication system, cylinder heads and timing, as well as mechanical elements seizing remained unresolved. Repair costs are astronomical in relation to the price of the car. Since 2003, new variants of the 2.5 TDI appeared, marked BDG, 163 HP, and BDH and BAU, 180 HP each. The latter still met the Euro 3 standard, but BDG and BDH already met the Euro 4 standard. Importantly, these engines were much better than the previous ones, but the only truly successful engine was the BAU engine. That's why its code is often given in sales offers, not only Passats, because generally you can fall in love with a 2.5 TDI diesel. Great performance with reasonable fuel consumption, but only if you have BAU. The BDH and BDG variants have problems with the injection system, and getting them to a state of tune is not worth the money or effort. Typical faults. In other areas, despite its age, the Passat B5 holds up well. If the car is truly accident-free, it has no major corrosion problems. The worst in this respect are cars that have not been garaged and have been on the road for a long time, imported after floods, and models after collisions. The chassis may be in a terrible condition, although the bodywork usually looks much worse. However, there is a very wide range here, from cars in very good condition to cars that are practically ready for scrap. A thorough inspection of the chassis is essential when buying a Passat, and I would not recommend making a decision after looking under the car on the lot. In Passats, the electrics are already problematic, mainly because of their age. If you want your car to be fully functional, it is worth checking everything that is electrically controlled, as well as displays, radio, ventilation system, and even central locking. A lot of bad things were said years ago about the front suspension made of aluminum, which used to cause gray hair among drivers. The replacements were either of poor quality or very expensive, and the original parts were even more expensive. For a set of front wishbones, it is best to replace everything. You paid so much money that many users did not even earn that much. the situation is completely different now. Although a branded front suspension rebuild kit costing around $500 is still not cheap, it is replaced every 50,000 kilometers, not once a year as it used to be with a relatively cheap replacement. There is also no shortage of kits on the market for around $100, $150, which can also be installed when the car fails inspection or we want to sell it and show off some repair. Gearboxes and four-wheel drive systems are not failure-prone, but when buying a car with high mileage, you have to reckon with, for example, the need to replace bearings in a manual. An automatic transmission combined with a higher engine power also means a greater risk of its failure. Regardless of the price of the car and its age, repairing such a transmission is always expensive. So, if you are buying a Passat as a budget car, and not as a dream come true, choose a manual. Even if you have to replace the dual-mass flywheel, it is not that expensive. Thanks for listening to me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and rate my video. If you know any problems with this car that I didn't mention, be sure to write about them in the comments.